Get out of the way. Here comes the team car. Today on Hot Track RC, we have the RC10 team car. All the parts are laying on the workbench and it's not going to build itself. So if you want to see how this race buggy goes together, stick around! We're going to build this buggy up to the kit spec, and then in a future episode we'll set it up for the track, including springs, ride height, tires, gearing, and all that good stuff. Of course, I can't help but use the Phillips head pan screws because that's just what I do. I'll show you that. So I think we just need to get at it. This manual has nice vintage graphics on the cover. The inside's what we've come to expect from recent re-releases. I'm going to pick out these black steel hex drive countersunk screws and replace them with the aluminum Phillips, just because I like that vintage feel. There's 1/4 inch long screw. The rest are 1/2 inch, except for the two 7/8 inch long bell crank screws. There's the 1/2 inch. For this step, we only need one for the body mount. For this kit, you only need 14 of the 1/2 inch long screws because the Stealth transmission takes smaller hex drive screws. That's the way it was originally. And you need the one short 1/4 inch screw and you need two bell crank screws. If you're building a 6-gear car, then you'll need 4 more of the 1/2 inch screws. I've been buying these aluminum screws off of eBay and they are a bit pricey. I'm going to check out McMaster-Carr and see if their screws look vintage. They do have aluminum flathead Phillips drive like these, but I don't think they're going to be gold plated. I think these countersunk holes are a little deeper than they were in the original pan cars, and so the cone of that flathead screw is protruding beyond the bottom of the pan and it's hitting the nose piece. So it's a little bit loose. You have to really snug these up to get all that play out. So make sure you've tightened them up enough, but I've found on the last 2 cars that if you just crank them down, they work fine. I was considering upgrading later to the World's Car bell cranks, but there's a little tip that I found in the original team car manual, which I'll show here, that suggests using tie wraps around the servo saver to stiffen it up. And there it is. If you read that note up there, you'll see they tell you to go ahead and tie wrap this right around this flexure member here, and it fits perfectly. These little notches hold the tie wrap in place. It's like it was meant to be. Now, the original car, they showed O-rings there, but the O-rings didn't do a whole lot because they weren't very stiff. This pretty much locks up the servo saver, and for modern servos with steel gears in them, that's just fine. So I think this is the way to go, and I kind of like that cool retro mod, so I don't think I'm going to replace these bell cranks unless I break them. Now here's another piece of hardware that's not original. These bell crank nuts were originally molded plastic. You can kind of see them in that picture there. They're obviously not metal. I can't find reproductions of those molded parts anywhere. If you know where to find those, drop me a comment below. The E-clips coming with these re-release kits are silver. I like the black-phosphate look the original cars had, so I'm going to use those, but again, really has no effect on the build of the kit. Here, because of that web on this caster block, you have to reach for the wrench. Now, these caster blocks are 15-degree, and we just built the J. Halsey, and it came with 30-degree caster blocks and the short arms. That's a real head-scratcher, and this team car is still using the 15-degree. I believe the World's Car that came after the team car used 30-degree casters. Now, here are the inline steering axles, and you have to push these all the way in so that the kingpin will slide through the steering arm and the hole in the axle. I don't have it quite far enough here, and I'm going to find out in a moment. But really, it's not a big deal. It would be easier to push these down on a hard surface. So don't do as I do, do as I say. But now we're going to try to push that through, and it's not going to go. Another minor difference with the World's Car is it comes with aluminum axles and a set screw on the backside that locks into the kingpin. I think this is a pretty minor upgrade, but it is a difference. Now we've got that on center and everything slides through well, so we can finally get this together. Because of the mild 15-degree caster block angle coming with this car, there's no interference issues like we saw on the J. Halsey These long arms have nice radiuses around the hinge pin areas, so everything clears well. I always like to twist my E-clips after they pop in to make sure they're really in the groove. If they spin, they're in. If they're tight and they won't turn, then they're probably not popped all the way in. Now, these arms are reversible. There's only one arm, and it goes either side. Just flip it the right way for that side. And that's a nice feature because when you break an arm, you don't have to worry about whether you have the right side or the left side in stock. And there's that mild angle, and some of that's taken out because of the kick up on the nose plate. So not a lot of caster on this car. Frankly, I don't really miss those short gull wing arms that the original Gold Pans had. They were just so stubby. These feel a lot better proportioned for this car, even though they're short by today's standards. Now, I love this shock tower. All those holes and just the shape of it. When that came out back in the day, I was really jealous. Somehow I couldn't manage to get one for myself for a long time. I eventually did. And then I realized that it makes the body a little tougher to install, so just be aware of that. You have to slide it in between the two instead of just dropping it straight down. But I love the way it looks, and then it gives you real functional options for that shock mounting point, so you can dial in your car. And we're using the innermost location for the camber link ball studs. That's the way the original Team Car manual shows it and gives you the best geometry for this kit. The new manuals all show putting these arm mounts onto the shock tower and then mounting the whole assembly to the nose piece. But all the original manuals showed it like this, where you put the arm mounts on the nose piece first. And for some reason, I'm kind of nostalgic about that. I just like bolting these on. So I'm doing it differently than the manual shows, but we'll get to the same place. And I love driving these Phillips screws in. Now, if you use the kit screws, which you probably will, I recommend going with a 2.5 millimeter hex driver. That fits much better than an inch size. And you may have noticed that these arm mounts are marked left-hand, right-hand, but it's pretty hard to get them backwards because they don't really fit. You can get a hex driver in here to get these screws for the shock towers in, so you don't need a ball in to do this. Again, another reason why I just like to do it the original way. And now, I don't know why, but I just think that's cool looking. And the bell cranks are in there. The only thing bugs me is those steel lock nuts. It should be plastic. All right, now we're going to put the hinge pins together and get these arms mounted up. And they are a thing of beauty, in my opinion. Don't forget your inner E-clips. Those E-clips, if you are bashing outdoors, eventually will pop off because you'll get wear on the back edge of those arms, and then you'll start catching those E-clips and they'll pop off. I used to replace those, but I never had a problem with the hinge pins working their way out. Next, we're moving on to the transmission. This manual has a little more detail here than previously. It talks about this thrust washer and how to put it together. In the RC10T manual, it showed just loose balls, and it didn't talk about these washers having grooves in them and orienting them correctly. So it's nice to see the manuals caught up with that. And here I'm adding a little black grease to the balls and orienting that washer the right way, and then that's going to be a real nicely operating ball race. And it'll take two of the smallest size bearings, but one of those bearings sits underneath the diff gear. It doesn't actually slide into that outdrive. Now we need to put all the balls into that diff gear. Make sure you have it oriented the correct way. The balls will drop right in. And now we'll get our diff grease on there. Careful not to pop the balls back out. Just get a nice amount on each ball. And then I'm going to do something that seems crazy. Why am I doing this? I don't know, because the manual tells me to, but it can't be right? I don't know. It tells you to put diff lube in between the outdrives and the diff rings. I don't know why. I think I'm going to regret that. But there it is. All right, now we'll put our gear on our outdrive and slide the second side on, and now we need our little wing nut that comes with a molded aluminum nut inside plastic wings. Oh, but don't forget the spring. This spring is interesting. It's a square profile. I think that's the first I've seen that. I don't know why. You're supposed to break them in by compressing them first. We'll drop that in. Now we'll get our wing nut and just make sure that that contacts the screw so that it can get started, and then drive that all the way down to where those ears touch the bottom, and then we'll back it off a little bit. I got to get all the way down and now back off an 1/8 turn or a 1/4 turn and see how it feels. And that feels pretty good, so I'm happy. And now we'll put the other end in. That's just to kind of cap that side off. And okay, now I'm going to do something else that's crazy. I'm going to put diff lube on all the gear teeth. Why am I doing that? The manual says to do it. In the original manuals, it said not to put this diff lube anywhere else except on the diff balls. I don't know. This is not the first manual that said to do it. Now we need to put this cross pin in the top shaft. This is going to transfer torque from our slipper clutch assembly. This pin tries to go sideways on you, so you just have to be patient. This may not be the best tool to use because I could mar my nice aluminum shaft. Now I'm going to use this box end to center the pin to push through into the hole there. And that worked really well. That was the right thickness, but again, kind of abusive to a nice tool, but I think I got away with it. Now we'll drop the idler gear in place, and this diff assembly has an adjuster screw on one side. I'm going to put that on the slipper clutch side. Honestly, I don't remember if that's the way it's supposed to go. This manual doesn't say anything about it. Now when you put these bearings in, it's best to use a tool that pushes on the outer race, so you're just pushing the outer race into its bore. If you push on the inside, you're overloading the bearing, and the balls could get dented and the races could get damaged. So be aware of that. I don't know why I stuck that small wrench into that big hole. That made no sense. All right, now there's a small cap that will pop into place to seal up the transmission. It fits tightly enough that I don't think you need any glue. Still turning freely. This felt gasket's not my favorite, being white in color. That's really the only beef I have with it. I like these foam ones that I got that are aftermarket, but again, just personal preference. I got to put these standoffs on the side of the case, and then we'll place that gasket right in there. Now we can attach our motor plate, and this is kind of weird the way this goes on. But when you look at the hole pattern, you'll figure it out. The motor goes against that round surface of the transmission case, so you can see how it lines up. I think, using some Loctite on these screws is smart, but like I've said before, I've never really had a problem with these backing out, so I'm lazy about it. These transmission case housings are a little bit warped off the tree. That's kind of normal for a part this size. When you tighten all these screws down, then everything flattens out, and that's when you'll know if the transmission is all lined properly and everything's turning smoothly. So let's see. Yeah, everything looks good there. Don't over tighten the screws, just snug them up. This spur gear is an 81 tooth, and it's going to screw onto our slipper clutch assembly. No diff on that, even though it's got the holes for the balls. Here we've got one pad, and there's a cross slot in the back hub there that slides onto that pin. Now one ball bearing slides in there so that the outer slipper clutch disc can spin relative to the shaft. Now a washer, and I'm going to put a little black grease on this thrust bearing that takes the force from the spring that we're going to put on. And clean that up a bit. And then the second washer. Those are stamped, so you might want to put the sharp edges away from the bearing. And now we'll put the spring and the lock nut. You need some tools to put into the out drives to tighten this up, tighten it up so that the shaft just protrudes beyond the lock nut, and that should be a good starting position. Now we can put on our spur gear, and there's 2 button head screws that are used. I'm test fitting this, but I am going to Loctite these. These don't go in very far because there's not much material to work with, so I think Loctite is important here, or these definitely could work their way out. Don't overdo it. You don't want Loctite where you don't want it. I've really warmed up to the look of the stealth transmission. I used to think it looked weird after spending so much time with the 6-gear, but I really appreciate the performance of that 3-gear design. On the tree, we have these bushings, which would have been used on like the J Halsey with a biased dog bone, but this has U-joints, so we don't need them. All right, now the shock tower shows 2 different length screws holding it in, which is a good idea, but the kit only comes with the 3/8 inch long. Also, this shock tower does not have the inner hole that the team car would have had. I think they're using the same part number they've used for the 40th anniversary and the J Halsey, and they didn't put that hole. That would be easy enough to add, and maybe I'll do that. So for now, we're going to mount this with all 3/8 inch screws because that's all we have. Actually, there's 5/16, but you got to use them on the transmission brace. If you don't, you're going to have a problem. The ball studs, as you see, will go on the innermost position, which didn't exist right there on the early Edinger parts. Those wing tubes were longer and they extended down. The bulkheads were different and there was no place to put the ball stud right there. So this is a modification. There's actually been a few versions of this bulkhead, quite a few. The World's car didn't have all the holes outboard for the camber links because they only use these inboards. So anyway, you got to use the wrench here because of the wing tube bosses. And you can see the screws stick out just a little bit there. It's really not objectionable. And now we get to screw this to the pan. We'll leave it loose here so that we can get the side bulkhead screws in and everything will align and float until we've got all 4 screws in place. Then we'll tighten everything down. These are really important for the structural rigidity of the car. If those side screws come loose, then things flex way too much. And now we can tighten those down. Don't over tighten them. They're long, but you can strip them out. Now we can start to admire the beauty of this car. I do like the original white nylon parts against this gold pan. The blacks are cool, but I'm kind of happy they did this in gold. The original team cars, as others have said, had black pans. Now we're going to use these 832 screws to attach the transmission. This was a change when they went from the 6-gear transmission to the Stealth. The 6-gear had the larger gold Phillips screws, and these are downsized, more like a modern car. The first time you install these, it takes a lot of torque because you're threading the screw holes. So I'm going to use the L arm here, but I'm going to leave these loose like we did with the bulkhead because we got several other screws to install, including the transmission brace. Now this transmission brace has a countersunk hole, unlike the originals, and it's a universal. It could work with the 6-gear. I might replace this with one of the carbon fibers, but we'll see. Now this is where you see the 5/16 goes into the transmission because that's all the deeper the hole is on the transmission. So don't get your screws mixed up. Start with the short ones and back. Don't forget your washers. And leave these a little bit loose because we got more to do after this. Long ones up front here. And then we got to go back to that chassis motor plate interface. They never line up perfectly. That's the way these cars have always been. So you have to flex things a little bit. Use some Loctite. Don't cross thread them. So get it lined up and then get it started right before you torque it in. If you go in sideways and force it in, then that's that. And that is going to strip out and come loose. Now that that's tight, we can go ahead and finish tightening our transmission, and just be careful that little L arm doesn't slip on you. You don't want to wallow out your fasteners. And finally, we can tighten up the transmission brace, and then we'll be all good on that. One of the first things I check with any gold pan is whether it has a stealth transmission in it, and I'm glad that this one has it. It's going to make it a great driver. Now we can put the rear arms on. They are marked left and right, including the arm mounts. The arm mounts include both anti-squat and toe-in. So really important that you get them on the correct side, and you can put them on the wrong side. Nothing will prevent that. So be careful. The car will do some very wonky things if you do that. Now, this is interesting. The manual here clearly states to build the short wheelbase. That is the first time I've seen one of these manuals specify. I always build the long wheelbase, and I'm doing the short here, and we'll see how it drives. I'm a little worried about the weight bias, just more weight hanging over the rear axle, but maybe it'll help the car rotate better, so we'll see. And of course, make sure that you get both of your arms mounted in the same hole set, or you'll have a really strange geometry. And we will just snug those up, don't over tighten them. And moving on here, we're going to build our hub carriers. And we have symmetrical hub carriers, so you don't have to worry about left, right. These are cool looking U-joints. They turn really freely, and they're counterbored inside, so they're not as heavy as you might think. They are the older 1/4 inch stepped axle geometry. Now use a tool again that pushes on the outer race of the bearing so you don't damage those. The manual says to use 1 shim on the inboard side here, and we're going to revisit that later. I think we're going to end up making a change there. But we're going to put right now 2 shims on the outside. Now, this controls the axle engagement into the outdrives along with suspension geometry. So it is important. You might think that those axle spacers are pretty thin and won't make much difference. But when you do the fine tuning, it actually matters. Pushing this roll pin through here was a lot easier on this kit than it was on the RC10T. Now right here you can see there's some axial play, so that could take another shim, which is something that will be helpful for us later. Now we got to install our hinge pins and just keep going with those E-clips. There's a lot of them, even inside the shocks. And let's line this up. All these pins go through easily, maybe a slightly on the loose side. And don't forget the E-clip on the other end of the hinge pin. I'll do the other side off camera so that we can move on to turnbuckles, my favorite. These fit really tight in the ball cups, and so I decided, all right, I'm not going to do what I did previously and just force these on. Let me get some black grease and dip the thread in that grease and try to loosen these up a little bit. Now, it definitely helps, but I would say they're still tight. And I'm feeling like maybe drilling them is a good idea, but I did not do that. I did end up like working them all the way in and then taking them back off and then adding grease again. Now I'm noticing something here. This doesn't seem to be right. The manual is calling out a 2.06 long turnbuckle and a 1 inch spacing between the ball cups. That's impossible. That's not going to work. And then over here where you need the long turnbuckles on the steering, it's calling a 1.65. That should be the 2.06. So they've got it reversed here. So no big deal. I mean, they all use the same ball cup, so you got to put them together anyway. But you'll just have to make sure you don't accidentally try to over or under space the 2 different turnbuckle sizes. So here I'm actually building the front steering turnbuckles, even though I want to be building the rear camber links, but we'll get to that when we get to it, since we started on these. And again, I'm kind of doing a double grease routine here. Got them the same length, and we'll put those up front for later. And here's the rear camber links. And remember, they go 180 degrees from each other. They pop on easily, and we're all good there. Just put your dog bones in the outdrives, and now we've got some articulation going here. And this is always exciting. I just love those suspension components and making them work. And here we go with the front camber links. And make sure you're getting all of your turnbuckles oriented correctly with the little groove on the left side that denotes the left-hand thread. And here are the longer 2.06 long turnbuckles. They are a little bit canted because of the 15-degree caster, so you have to rotate them a little bit from flat to get them to fit right. But there it is, everything on, and no binding issues this time. So that is a good thing, and looks good. Like the long arms, like that shock tower. I'm happy. Here's the rear. That all looks good as well. This car has such a classic, distinctive look. I just love it. And I've really been working on these cars the better part of my life now. So I'm good and stuck with them. All right, let's build up some rear shocks. I want to build one test shock because this is going to be a runner, and it's really important that we get the spacing inside the rear shocks correct so that the suspension travel is limited, both to protect the suspension arm and to control the engagement of the dog bone into the transmission outdrive, which is really critical. So we need to go ahead and install the seals into the shock body. We'll use a little slime there to lubricate the inside of the O-ring. And then the spacer goes on, another O-ring, and then a washer. And now this just clicks into place here. Now notice how much spacing the original team car had. This kit doesn't show hardly any spacing. That's my original shaft from an 84 Edinger. It has 5/8 inch of fuel line on it. That is what the manual said to do, but they didn't provide the fuel line. They just said to go get some and put it in there. I'm going to go 1/2 inch. I just feel like that might be the right amount. I don't really know that. Need a little slime to push this on with. It fits pretty much perfectly. This is a nice solution. It's kind of vintage. Now you would just use the plastic spacers probably, but they didn't come with the kit, and I had the fuel line. So that feels good. We'll see if it's the right length. Let's put this eyelet together. That popped into place nicely. And we'll screw on here. Make sure you use shock shaft pliers and a tool to spin it on. Don't over tighten. All right, now we just need a cap on here, and then we can start our test fit. A little bushing goes on the top. We'll put it into place. And now what we want is for that bottom eyelet to force the arm up a little bit. We don't want the arm to be all the way down, and that's the case here. But is it too much? Well, okay, it's going to control the downstroke of the arm just fine. But there's one other thing that's even more critical, and that is the engagement of that dog bone into the outdrive. And we are right at the limit here. And you can see the worst case scenario is when that pin is straight up on the top side, that it is coming out of that outdrive. It is right on the edge. That's as far out as you could drive it. Now, without the limiter on there, that travels all the way out. You cannot run it like that. You will severely damage that outdrive, and obviously it'll disable the car. Now on the inside, that can also be a problem, but in this case, it's on the short side, so the pins are not hitting on the inside. Everything moves okay, so I think, 1/2 inch limiter is probably what I'm going to stick with. I tried the 3/8 inch also, and it's just too short. The dog bone's coming out of the outdrive with that, so we definitely don't want to use a shorter one. We'll go with the 1/2 inch, and then we'll control the insertion depth further with the shims, but we'll come back to that later. Now to build the front shocks, this goes together the same way except for the shafts are shorter, and we'll jump ahead here and load the body up with all the seals. I got that I didn't push all the way down, and I've never had that happen before where I pulled it out and had a few on there, but I checked it. Everything eventually got inserted correctly, and that feels good. So now we can put the eyelets together. I've noticed that sometimes when you go to pop these together, it's real tight and it doesn't want to go. And when that happens, flip the eyelet around the other way and it'll probably go in easily. They're not exactly the same, so you got a 50-50 chance that it pops in easily or it doesn't go. I don't like to force it the hard way. All right, that's together and looking good. So now we got a full set that we need to oil up. But first we'll put these O-rings on for the cap and use a little slime on that so the caps go on easily. We're using 30 weight shock oil, which came with the kit, front and rear. Probably over time, we will dial that a little bit, maybe up to 32, 35 in the front. Maybe. I don't really know for sure on the team car. I always ran a little bit thicker oil on the Edinger gold pan with the short arms because those short arms needed help. So there's all the little bubbles that were trapped underneath the spacing on the shock shaft. So let's finish those up. Oh, I'm wrong. Those were the fronts. But anyway, those were the bubbles. Now this looks like the right amount of oil. And we got a nice dome there. I don't put oil in the cap anymore because it just always ends up being way too much. Now we got a little bit of rebound, so we'll end up bleeding that a bit. The idea that you could remove all of the air from inside the shock and have it function properly is just not true. That shock shaft takes up space, so when it is in the compressed mode, it's using volume up inside the shock, and then when it's pulled out, it reduces the amount of solid volume inside the shock. So there has to be air in there that can compress because the fluid won't. So when you have all fluid in there, then the shock shaft will not compress up into the body. So you just get as much out as you can to where you're not aerating the oil too much, but it still allows everything to move all the way up and down. And I usually leave it to where it's just got a little bit of rebound when you push it all the way in, but it's not tight. And those feel pretty good. So 2 more to go. And with these O-rings, you really don't have to over-tighten the caps. You can do it finger tight and they won't leak. Unlike the originals, which had a flat washer in there and you had to tighten it down on those. But I just get it to where it bottoms out lightly but is not overly tight. And that looked like the right amount of fluid there. And again, you could severely over tighten this with the amount of torque I have there, leverage. That looks good. Now for the fun part, we get to put the springs on. These shock collars work fine as long as you do not over tighten that screw or you will strip it out. The slot in these cups was an upgrade that they made at some point. Before then, you had to take the eyelets off to change springs. Now this team car uses 0.71 long shock shafts in the front, and the original car used 0.56. That's why that spring collar is having to be adjusted lower because the springs are the same spring part number that would have been used with the shorter shock shaft. And that's because of the long arms. You need to stretch out further to get to the arm mounting locations. So anyway, that's normal that they're kind of in a lower position. In the rear, though, they'll be all the way up, and we'll see what we do with ride height. We'll probably have to go with a softer spring to get ride height lower, which is definitely a challenge with these cars. Now to mount up the shocks. I love this step. Start with the bushing. We'll put our front shock on, a washer, a lock nut, and then we're going to go with the outside position on the arm. That's going to give us the most aggressive angle there. And we'll go all the way in with the screw, and that feels really good. No binding, totally smooth. I'm happy. All right, and then we'll tighten up our lock nut, trying not to scratch the cap when we do this. So we can go to the second side here, and same thing, and both sides feel good. So sometimes when you put these together, you know, something binds a little bit, maybe the pivot point down on the arm, and you have to loosen the nut up or the screw up. I didn't have that problem. So on to the rears. Again, same thing with this shock cap. Now we're going outer hole here as we did our test fit. This is one place where you could use a ball end. That's like the only screw on the car that really needs it, unless you're trying to get your servo out after it's mounted. Now we're down to one shock, and then we can admire our work. And with any luck, everything's going to operate smoothly. And let's check out the rears. Those both feel really good. The fronts felt good. Everything looks good. It's just an attractive looking car. So what do you think of the hard ano shocks? I was so used to the gold, but I really like the look of those with the black caps. So I'm really excited that they put those in this kit. And let's check our out drive here. So, all right, this is where we're at. We've got that pin right on the edge of the out drive. So what can we do? Well, we can play with shims. So let's take a look at that. I don't really want to add more downstroke limitation because the droop of the suspension arms looks good to me. I don't want to reduce that further. So what I want to do is I want to move the whole axle assembly inward so we'll get more depth of penetration into the out drives. So let's pop this back apart. Luckily, that roll pin was not tight in this kit, or it would have been a real bear to get this back apart. Now, remember, we had one shim on the inside and two on the outside, which there's no reason we can't move at least one shim, one more on the inside, but I think we can do better than that. I have a couple shims in my parts stores, but I am low. I got to order more of those. And so we're going to put 3 on the inside and 1 on the outside. Now, the team car also had more on the inside originally than this kit shows. We're going 3 on the inside, 1 on the outside, and I think that's going to help us just a little bit on the penetration so that we'll be safely in the operational zone. If not, I wouldn't mind adding a 4th on the inside, and I think there's enough space to do it. But so far we've moved that back a couple of shim spacings, and we'll just pop it back together and see where we're at. Luckily, this isn't too difficult to take apart, again, particularly with that loose roll pin. So here we're at. Okay, we're in. It's close, but we're in. So see what you think. Now, if you move the upper shock mounting point inward by drilling another hole, then that would change the geometry and you'd be more safely. Now look here, we're closer there to hitting on the inside. So now the position is better. See, we're getting close there. So I think we're close to optimal now. And it's just a matter of how much we limit that suspension travel. Got to do the second side. We'll do that off camera so we can get onto the nose tubes. Now, I ran into a couple minor issues here. The first one being that the tube is hitting the hex nut. There is a smaller geometry hex nut you could use instead of this big one, but I'm going to rotate that nut just a little bit so the point of the nut is not hitting the tube. So I'll have to unscrew that, and it turns out I'll need a wrench because the nut driver won't fit on it assembled, and I turned it just far enough that it clears better. Now we'll find that the tube's a little longer for this particular pan nose combination. It's not lining up, and if you try to force it, then you're going to have a problem. So, you would have to go in here sideways like this. It won't line up. So what do? I did actually find in the manual, I hadn't remembered, that it says to actually put this side screw in first. And so that's what we're going to do. And by doing that, this one will obviously be lined up and in. And then we can just stretch the pan a little bit and force the front of the tube down into position on the nose piece. So yeah, just bend it out a little bit. And I want to get this not tight, but close to tight so it doesn't twist. And line this up, and then we'll be good to go. These button head screws have a relatively small hex size, so you have to be careful with them. Don't use a rounded out tool. And we'll get the second side on here, and then I like to snug these up with an L-arm. The nose tubes are some of the finishing touches on this car, and they just pull everything together. And just be careful you don't let this L-arm twist on you and wallow out the fastener. The hex depth is just really shallow on these. All right, now for the battery cup. And this is real easy. This is just now after we're weary from building the rest of the car, we get to just install some of these screws into the nylon plastic parts and enjoy the finished product. This kit now on the re-release shows a washer over the battery strap, which I don't think any of the original cars showed that, or maybe they did after a while, but both of these cap screws have the cross hole in it for the clip. I'm not a big fan of these body clips that they give you with the re-release kits, so I'm going back with the vintage style, and there you can see there was a hole in both, and we're going to put it on the correct side now and enjoy looking at this. All right, I'm putting this gear cover on, but don't worry, we're driving this car. I just wanted to see it on the... I couldn't wait until I get a motor and put it in here to do this. So, it pretty much is plug and play. That hole is slightly off center, so I had to kind of get it worked on there, but that looks good. I'm glad I didn't have to cut that. Look at these tires. We got the Team Associated logo, rib style, and very vintage looking. And then we've got one-piece wheels. That's what they were going to. They're vented, so we don't have to drill the holes there. The rear also has Team Associated logo. It's got foam in it. Both only have the logo on one sidewall, so make sure you get that right. You don't want to be embarrassed and not have the logo there. We got some ribbing inside the front, but they have no foam. These are, they're pretty heavy compound, so it takes some doing to work these over the wheel. So just take your time. It'll go. It might feel at first like, oh, this is not going to go, but it will. And then it'll just pop into place all of a sudden. And you can see I'm struggling with it a bit there, but then boom, it all goes in, and just kind of work it around, make sure it's fully seated. And I like this. This is a cool looking tire, but I don't think I'll drive these. I got to put carpet track tires on the car, but they look good. So for the rears, same thing, but we got the foam here, so we got to make sure the foam doesn't get stuck in between the bead, and we'll have to work that in. But I think the foam is cut to a reasonable size. I don't see the need to do anything with that. So just take your time and work it around, check the bead. I got it a little bit out of the track there on one side, so I'm just going to continue to go around. I'm not going to glue these tires just because it's Shelf Queen. Obviously, you need to if you're going to run them, but we'll roll them around, work that foam into place, and that's looking good. So I'd call that success. That's a smart-looking wheel tire combo right there, so let's put them on the car. The rear wheels have cross slots at 90 degrees, so they pop into the pin pretty easily. And everything goes on without any binding. Some wheels used to be kind of tight to push on. These are not. Now we put the two flanged bearings in the front wheels. These are the bearings that the 40th anniversary came with, not the J. Halsey bearings. So we're back to that style. And standard lock nuts and a second side, and then this is going to be a wrap. And yeah, everything's sliding on, no binding, and that looks great. Let's try the suspension. Oh, that feels good. And the camber and the steering adjustments are not too bad. We'll adjust them for the track, but they're a decent starting point on this kit. Droop looks good. That's a slick looking car. All right. Well, I love this gold. And, I guess a little controversial that they changed from black to gold for the team car. But I guess I shouldn't say this, but I was actually kind of considering on my 2014 Worlds car, maybe building it up with a gold pan because I really just wanted it to look like a gold pan. But then I realized I can't do that. And now I'm really glad I didn't. But I'm so happy the team car is gold. Well, that was a great build. Now we have to get the motor and the electronics in this car. Then we got to build the Cougar 2 works, get them both to the track, and see how they do. Given how close to the holidays these cars came in, I hope everybody has or had a very Merry Christmas. And we'll see you next time!